worldwide, internationally,
No
make
question.
such advances.
No question.
I'm going to give it another minute because
Sure.
the numbers of in the participants are increasing. I feel like I'm watching the stock market, just the numbers going up, which is great. Yeah, it's 8 o'clock now. I hear the Star Spangled Banner
There you go.
every morning at 8 o'clock. It's kind of interesting to be in, like
Amazing.
you said, in DC.
Amazing.
Well, I'm going to get started because we have almost 40 people. So I'm going to get started now. And it truly is my honor to introduce Dr. Aili Adashi to give today's grand rounds. Dr. Adashi is a renowned academic physician, reproductive endocrinologist, and public health thought leader. He's a tenured professor of medical sciences at the Warren Albert Medical School of Brown University and former Dean of Medicine and Biological Sciences. He's a graduate of the inaugural class of the Tel Aviv University School of Medicine, received a Master of Science in Healthcare Management at Harvard Chan School of Public Health, did his OBGYN residency at Tufts in Boston, an REI fellowship at Hopkins, and he's done postdoctoral training in reproductive biology at UC San Diego. His distinguished research career spans reproductive medicine, ovarian biology, health policy, bioethics, and women's health. He has authored or co-authored almost 900 peer-reviewed publications and book chapters, edited 16 books, and mentored over 50 postdoctoral fellows and trainees. Dr. Adashi's work has not only advanced scientific knowledge, but also shaped national and international policy through his service with the National Academy of Medicine and the World Health Organization. He's former president of the Society for Reproductive Endocrinologists, SGI, the Society for Gynecologic Investigation, AGOS, the American Gynecological and Obstetrical Society, and former director of the Division of Reproductive Endocrinology at ABOG. Among his many honors, he is a member of the National Academy of Medicine and the Association of American Physicians, and has received multiple Lifetime Achievement Awards, including from ASRM, and truly a giant in reproductive endocrinology. He's talking today on in vitro gametogenesis, eggs and sperm from a buccal smear, and we welcome your participation in today's grand rounds. Take it away, Dr. Adashi.
Thank you, Elaine. You did me honor, and I really appreciate the kind introduction and the opportunity to revisit. It's been a few years. Today, we will be speaking about the future, uh, about a reality that is a little hard to imagine today, but is going to dominate the life of those of us who will be practicing um, going forward. But before we start, it's always good to reflect a bit on the fact that in 2028, we will be celebrating the 50th anniversary of IVF, which started, of course, in the UK. This is the Lancet report of the birth of the very first infant attributable to IVF. I'm, of course, making reference to Louise Joy Brown, who is shown here in the arms of her mother, Leslie. Dr. Edwards, who is perhaps best known for this accomplishment, received the Nobel Prize in 2010. And the only reason his two collaborators, Patrick Steptoe and Jean Purdy, did not share in the Nobel Prize is because they unfortunately passed away by then. And it is the policy of the Nobel Prize Committee to award the Nobel Prize only to living recipients. Dr. Edwards himself passed away in 2013. This is the Lancet obituary that was written at the time. In the US, as you know, we were a bit behind, but thanks to the Norfolk team, headed by Howard and Georgiana Jones, we finally caught up, and the first baby, American baby born, was born on December the 28th, 1981. I'm referring to Elizabeth Jordan Carr, who was the first American IVF baby, who was shown on virtually every American outlet from the Boston Globe to Life magazine and beyond. But today we are focusing on what will perhaps dominate the next 50 years, which is IVG, or in vitro gametogenesis. The beginning of this revolution, I would say, is really traceable to Japan and to two scientists who deserve much, if not all, of the credit. Mitinori Saito is an MD PhD at Kyoto University, and Katsuhiko Hayashi, PhD, now at Kyushu University, worked with Professor Saito in Kyoto until some time ago, in which context he was key as well to the development of IVG. As is usually the case, the experimental paradigms deployed here involve the rodent on the one hand and the human on the other, and we will try to cover both to the degree possible. I can say at this point that the human paradigm, although highly advanced, is not quite there. And so there's still some ground to cover before we get there, let alone before we get approved to use this technology. All of this, notably, is attributable to stem cells, which come in two varieties, so-called embryonic or induced. Stem cells are unique in the sense that they can become anything. They can become amacrine neurons in the retina. They can become dopaminergic neurons in the striatum. And they could become motor neurons in the spinal cord. A rather striking illustration of this phenomenon was recently published in Nature, describing a paralyzed individual due to a spinal cord injury who had stem cells injected into his spinal column, as a result of which he was able to walk again. It is really stunning to imagine that we are now in a position to reverse spinal paralysis by the ejection of stem cells. And we can probably do much more and will be doing much more. In a word, medicine will be revolutionized yet again, courtesy of stem cell technology. Of course, today we will limit ourselves to stem cell-derived gametes, but as I mentioned, stem cells are everywhere. And I have recently written a column that attempted to do justice to what I call stem cell medicine, because medicine will change as a result of stem cells. Opportunities previously unavailable will open up, and it will become increasingly a dominant feature of medical practice, including ours. Science magazine appreciated this revolution and in 2021 dedicated a full spread to in vitro gametogenesis, authored by our Japanese colleagues. The New England Journal of Medicine, not to be outdone, commissioned a paper from two British investigators and published a paper titled Oocytes from Stem Cells. The National Academy of Medicine in 2023 convened a workshop that I had the privilege of planning and sharing that took place over 2.5 days in Washington, D.C. This was titled In Vitro-Derived Human Gametes as a Reproductive Technology. The Nuffield Council on Bioethics, which you may be aware of, is the primary ethical or ethics organization in the United Kingdom. They, when studying human reproduction, placed in vitro-derived gametes at the top of their list. And so it's clear to anybody who is in reproduction that in vitro-derived gametes are the next big thing. And it will take some time, but it will make a difference. Yes, the Nuffield Council studies a number of other issues that I will briefly go through. Many of which you may be familiar with. But at the top of the list, they have in vitro gametogenesis. I don't think any of us will argue with the statement that in vitro gametogenesis is a disruptive technology. Whether or not it's achievable in a human, as I already hinted, remains to be seen. And the timeline thereof, likewise, is at this point unknown. Now, all of this, as I said, rests heavily on the technology of stem cells, which come in two varieties. The first one, the so-called embryonic stem cells, were initially introduced in 1958 by John Garden from Cambridge University, who started with essentially a somatic nucleus, transfected it to an enucleated oocyte, and produced a quasi-zygote, a blastocyst in a cell mass, etc., from which he harvested so-called embryonic stem cells. In 2006, induced pluripotent stem cells were introduced by Shinya Yamanaka from Kyoto University, who started with a somatic cell, transfected it with select transcription factors, and ended up with so-called induced pluripotent stem cells, which is what we mostly use these days. Both gentlemen were given the 2012 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in recognition of the importance of this subject matter. Now, in vitro gametogenesis in general involves starting with a somatic cell, converting it either to an embryonic or induced pluripotent stem cell, and then guiding that stem cell towards a gametogenic fate. What would it take? Well, if you want to accomplish this feat, you'd have to know what cues have to be applied along the way, by which sequence should those cues be applied, what timing ought to be followed. And you also have to take into account, in this case, the so-called niche. And what I mean by that are the somatic cells that surround the gametes in both the male and the female. As you know, of course, the oocytes are surrounded by granulosa and theca cells, and the sperm, for their part, are surrounded by the Sertoli cells. And so when and if we discuss gametes, we always need to take into account the somatic cells in which they are encased. The beginning was very modest and is perhaps traceable to a science paper in 2003, the senior author of which was Hans Scholler, who at the time was a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania, but has since become the director of the Max Planck Institute in Germany. The so-called oocytes are shown on the right lower hand side of this slide. That same year, Toshiaki Noche from Japan, on the pages of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, accomplished a similar feat. A year later, George Daly, who is presently the dean of Harvard Medical School, published in Nature on the derivation of embryonic stem cells and male gametes that were produced as a result. And the same holds true for René Rehopera, same year, who was at UCSF at the time. As the year went by, more significant papers in key journals made their appearance describing rodent uh, gametes that are produced from stem cells. And eventually, same held true for human gametes produced from stem cells, all in key leading journals. And so, as we look at where we stood in 2015, we could say that at that point, the germ cell specification pathway we recognized was not conserved between the rodent and the human, and we had to study those separately. And we also realized that the genetic networks involved were quite distinct as well. Still, as we look back at the state of the art in 2015, we could say that we knew how to convert stem cells to so-called primordial germ cell-like cells, which are the precursors of in vitro-derived gametes. What we didn't know how to do is how to go from there to in vitro-derived gametes, or so-called haploid post-meiotic mature gametes. In a word, we mastered the extragonadal component of the process, but we had yet to master the intragonadal counterpart. The final frontier we had to master was in vitro gametogenesis all the way. That was first accomplished really by Professor Hayashi in 2016 in a Nature paper titled Reconstitution in Vitro of the Entire Cycle of the Mouse Female Germline. He started with stem cells, combined them with somatic cells, produced primary oocytes, which gave rise to M2 oocytes that were fertilized, gave rise to a blastocyst, and eventually to pups. In a word, Professor Hayashi began with stem cells and ended up with pups. This is the first compelling example that in vitro-derived gametes are functional in every way, can be fertilized, can give rise to embryos, and can give rise to live pups. And in principle and in theory, this could all be recapitulated one fine day in the human. More of the same held true for the rodent male counterpart, which was reported in this case by Professor Saito in 2021. Which brings us back to what interests us, of course, the most, and that is the human paradigm. The furthest we have gone in this respect was described on the pages of the journal Science in 2018 by Professor Saito. He started off the process with human primordial germ cell-like cells, combined them with somatic cells, and pursued the now well-worn process, which in this case took him as far as the oogonial stage. What he could not accomplish is the production of an M2 oocyte, which is the fertilizable version of the human female gamete. And so we will have to concede that as we speak today, human IVG still needs to be taken to its logical conclusion. We're simply not there yet. And the likelihood is that our Japanese colleagues, or possibly other investigators, will ultimately get us there. But regardless of that, we can already appreciate the scientific and translational promise of IVG. On the scientific or theoretical side, IVG will afford us with an inexhaustible supply of germ cells. That is important for every investigator in this arena who no longer will have to struggle to secure germ cells. One of the favorite studies of scientists is the so-called functional non-mutant analysis, a study wherein they knock out one gene at a time and ask, what does this gene do? Or what happens when this gene is absent? You could do that if you had an inexhaustible supply of germ cells. And you could study germ somatic cell interactions, which presently you cannot do. For us as physicians, perhaps the more important piece is the fact that once IVG was successfully accomplished in a human, we could potentially undertake the reversal of germ cell failure. In other words, we could treat people who are afflicted by germ cell failure for one reason or another, and thereby avoid having to rely on, say, egg or sperm donation to overcome the deficiency. For the first time in human history, we'll be in a position to provide autologous gamete replacement rather than donated heterologous gametes. And we could, in principle, gene edit those gametes in cases where it is called for. Imagine a patient with Turner syndrome, whose karyotype is an XO karyotype. Could we edit those gametes and convert them into the appropriate genetic constellation? And for the first time in human history, this will produce, and we already have seen papers that are leading us in that direction, same-sex genetic parenthood. In other words, there is little question, but that in the next decade or two, same-sex couples will be in a position to be the parents not only of adopted children, but presumably genetically derived children. In the case of two men, of course, they will require a female surrogate to carry the pregnancy. But in the case of two women, that will be taken care of by one of the women in question. But the very notion that the biblical uh, concept of Adam and Eve will have likely been violated going forward, possibly in your lifetime, and I'm referring to the young members of the audience. There are other practical advantages of IVG that are going to be realized more proximately because they're going to affect the practice of IVF. Once IVG is operational, it will eliminate the need in the stimulation with gonadotropins and the egg retrieval that currently consume the lion's share of the time of IVF. Stated differently, IVF will be shortened and simplified. It will also do away with the donor banks we currently rely on for sperm and eggs in cases where those are not available naturally. And it will convert IVF largely, not entirely, to a laboratory procedure. I say not entirely because it will still require endometrial preparation and embryo transfer, but we will not be requiring the gonadotropic stimulation phase and the egg retrieval phase. In principle, or in theory, this could improve the affordability of IVF and therefore access to it. After all, IVF tends to be on the expensive part, is not always covered by insurance companies. And so this could make IVF available to a large segment or larger segment of the population. Whether this will actually happen in reality remains to be seen simply because of the American genius to jack up prices, even when it doesn't seem that like this might be the best way forward. Lastly, we need to mention that none of this can happen in a vacuum. It needs to be subject to careful regulation because it is a medical technology. It will be applied to people. It has to be safe. It has to be workable in every way, which is why we have the FDA and the jurisdiction thereof. At the FDA, IVG, once it's ready to be evaluated, will be screened by the so-called Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, or CBER for short, which will likely categorize IVG under the human cells, tissues, and products category, which the FDA evaluates on a regular basis. Before I close, I will raise the question that some of you may have already wondered about. Why is all of this research is carried out in Japan and not in the United States? And I remind all of us that there's a law in the books that prohibits the NIH from funding embryo research. And IVG can be viewed in that context, and the likelihood is that the NIH will not fund grants that are applied for in this arena. The law in question is known as the Dickey-Wicker Amendment, which first was passed in 1996, but that amendment has been attached to every U.S. budget since then, and it prohibits U.S. publicly funded, that is to say, NIH-funded embryo research. Mr. Dickey has since passed away. Mr. Wicker still serves in the Senate as the senator from Alabama. But one way or the other, if we're able to proceed and to produce gametes to order, we will be in a different point in life. As you can imagine, this has now been taken up by the private sector. One of the companies involved is known as Gamito. It's a New York-based company. Its IVG product is known as Fertilo, and it has just been granted by the FDA the approval to proceed with phase 3 clinical trials, which is the first step you have to take on the way to applying eventually for FDA approval. So stay tuned. We have largely discussed today something that will happen at an unknown time in the hopefully near, but could be distant future. But it's definitely going to be applicable to the life and practice of the younger members of this audience. So with that, I will close and open the session to any and all questions, should there be any. And thank you yet again for the opportunity to visit Georgetown and MedStar, albeit remotely. Uh, so thank you very much for the opportunity and the privilege.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adachi. This is really fascinating and a little frightening. Um, I am reminded of Brave New World, that
Yes.
incredible book,
Yes.
and it's very scary to be seeing that this is on the horizon. Um, I was going to ask you about the ethics of this, but you did talk a little bit about that with what the FDA and the Dickey Wicker law or amendment. But what kind of ethical safeguards are there across the world? Because a lot of the advances have come, let's say, from Japan and some other countries. So I welcome your comments about that.
Definitely. Well, Japan is interesting in the sense that they don't have quite the counterpart of the FDA. And on the whole, you would have to say that the Japanese have been quite freewheeling when it comes to new technologies. Um, and perhaps that's one reason we see this happening, proceeding in Japan without any governmental intervention or oversight that we know of, or any objections to speak of from any quarter. Needless to say, in the US, where we live in a pro-life, pro-choice um, environment, this will not be smooth sailing. And exactly what will transpire and how remains to be seen because we too are evolving in the face of other developments. Even IVF is still being contested, as you know, is being dealt with at the highest level of government, all the way to the president. Some of you may be aware of a recent Alabama ruling on this issue. And so in the US, where the pro-life, pro-choice debate is still raging, it's going to be a long, challenging haul for IVG to go beyond FDA approval to actual application uh, on a day-to-day basis. That said, as before, as is true of IVF and other technologies, Europe is doubtlessly going to lead the way in adopting this technology. Canada may be doing the same. And we will, in time, hopefully, work out our differences and apply IVG in a context that is acceptable in the US context. But it will be naive to sit here and assume that what will happen in the US will be comparable to what's happening in Japan. It will take some doing, but it will take education, it will take discussions, it will take give and take. But at the end of the day, some form of IVG will likely take place, although the road to that promised land may not be easy.
There are a number of things in the chat. Most of everybody is saying, fascinating talk, very interesting, and thank you. Dr. Chakraborty also says, of course, in obstetrics, we will see more pregnant women in their 50s. And I think Japan's population is shrinking, so likely it's a national priority there. And it's a great point. Um, I still feel fairly uncomfortable moving forward with this. Just because something can be done doesn't mean it should be done. And who is going to be putting the brakes on or deciding what is important in terms of applying this technology? I mean, I'm thinking of CRISPR, where the scientist in China put in this gene so that those twin girls would be immune to HIV. And he has gotten ridiculed throughout the scientific community. But what do you think? What do you hope for?
Well, Helene, this is what we call human evolution. The Chinese scientist who you could say was ahead of his time actually went to jail for what he did. He spent a few years in jail before he was released for having proceeded with germline editing before it was approved even in China. Uh, Needless to say, germline editing has now been batted around repeatedly in the United States because, as you say, one fine day it may be feasible. We hardly reached a consensus for the same reasons I discussed. We will be struggling with IVG. But germline editing, which we can all see has the potential in the right circumstances, that is to say, in parents who have a genetic compromise, It gives them a chance to have a genetically intact child. And what it does for humanity, it interrupts the chain of transmission of genetic disorders. Today, if any prospective parent is affected by a genetic disorder, we are just accepting the fact that down the line, this will be continuously transmitted. And so, again, it's a good thing, but it's running up against various ethical, legal, and conceptual objections, primarily in nations which struggle with these issues. Likelihood is that most of the European nations, perhaps with the exception of Hungary, will proceed with germline editing because they see the benefit of it and because they are not held back as much as some other nations by religious constraints. So I think you're perfectly correct in pointing out to IVG as yet another example of germline editing, an advanced reproductive technology that will doubtlessly run into objections in certain nations more than in others, by certain people more than others. But that does not prevent us or should not prevent us from laying out what is possible and then trying to deal with it to the best of our ability.
Hi there. This is Pam Lockey. I'm a complex family planner, so you know where I am on a lot of these issues. But I'm just going to point out this is so fascinating, and it's really great to learn about the science. And I'm going to say that there are potentials to make this more palatable to some of the people who are so anti what the science is doing. I mean, we're trying to give people are trying to give personhood to fertilized eggs, and as you have pointed out, the way that IVF works now, it's so long and arduous and expensive for women that you harvest a lot of eggs, you make a lot of embryos, and then there's the debate of what to do with all of these frozen embryos if you're going to give them personhood. And in this sense, none of that has to happen. So, in fact, you can just fertilize something at that moment and you don't have to subject people. So, in a sense, while I think unfortunately, the same Bible thumpers who want personhood for these embryos will also say this is not natural. Again, they don't have an argument that this is the potential for a human life, because until you have created that, which only has to be done at that moment, maybe it's a bonus.
Well, Lori, I can't thank you enough for articulating so well what I think is clearly a pro-women um, initiative, and for that matter, the germline editing example that Professor Landy brought up is a final analysis. It's a pro-family, pro-women initiative. But at the same time, as you are, I'm doubtlessly well aware, the environment we live in is struggling with these issues. Right, wrong, or indifferent, it's a reality. Um, I appreciated very much your point of view, and I can see exactly what you're saying. I was simply trying to be all-inclusive and realistic and scope the political, religious, and other environments we are all encased in and can't entirely ignore. So your point of view is welcome and well taken, and I appreciate you saying what you just did. And while I may personally be in full agreement with you, um, I'm trying to be inclusive and also realistic in terms of appreciating the reality we are all suffused by.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's very tough and intricate, and you're never going to please everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. Does anybody else have any comment or question? Well, this was really a fascinating talk from a very distinguished lecturer. And we thank you again, Dr. Adachi, for all the work that you've done, and especially for this lecture. You really have opened a lot of very interesting ideas that those of us who are in the weeds and so busy, we don't have time to think about these things, but you've really given us a lot of food for thought. So thank you again, and I look forward to future opportunities to meet you.
Likewise. Thank you.